Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast. Ozcast. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
I even love the smell of books. Hello, welcome to Tsundoku, the podcast for addicted readers everywhere. I'm Annie Hastwell.
And hi Annie, I'm Kath Keneally.
And I've got a new measure of addiction to reading, which is we've got one of those boxes in our neighbourhood, those wonderful boxes where everybody puts their old books. I haunt that thing.
Do you?
I time my dog walk. Usually after a weekend it's most full to make sure I can just check out what they've got. Amazing.
Excellent.
Usually they're pretty bad. But
for me, it's how many visits a week to the library. And a lot of books I just borrow on spec. So I might read a couple of chapters or I might read the whole book and then I have to take them back again and get some more. And I can go to the library 4 times a week. So I think, I'm a sad case.
Yeah, you are. That's serious addiction.
Annie, you've been reading Catherine McKinnon's new book. I remember her first one. Who is she?
She's an Adelaide writer. In fact, she went to the same school as I went to.
And me.
That's true. And I loved her first book because to me it was a bit like a David Mitchell book where you have layers of time and it's almost a bit detective-y. You're trying to work out who is this person from 3 generations ago. It's a very complex book, but it's very much about the early days on the east coast of Australia. Fascinating book. And she's written a new one called To Sing of War. It seems at the moment there's a lot around about the dropping of the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima. And her book deals with that. Fascinating topic. And the whole book is like tick, tick, tick. We know it's going to happen. And we're watching the lead up from 3 places. One is New Guinea. One is Japan, where there's innocent Japanese woman and her family have no idea what's about to happen. And the other one is Los Alamos, where they're actually designing and testing and arguing about the bomb.
Wow.
So in each of them there's a person connected to the other place. Like just to give one example, the woman in Japan, her husband is off fighting in New Guinea.
Oh.
So anyway, it's lovely in that way. And she describes it during the interview as a braided narrative, which I hadn't heard the idea of before, but it works very well. So I'll be talking to Catherine about that book.
Looking forward to that. And as often on Tsundoku, we like to look back at writers who might be in danger of being forgotten, one of whom is the great Beryl Bainbridge. And she was a very well-known British writer of the middle of last century and on towards about 2000. Very well known in Britain. She was 5 times shortlisted for the Booker Prize and always the bridesmaid. I think she was posthumously awarded it. And she had an outrageous personal life that she wasn't shy about putting into her book. So everybody knew who Beryl Bainbridge was, and she is a fantastic writer. And I recommend the biography of her by Brendan King. In fact, if you get interested, just called Beryl Bainbridge, Love by All Sorts of Means. Ken Bolton has been reading Beryl and become an absolutely crazed fan.
Talking now about a book that I suspect might have been read quite a bit over the holiday season. It's called To Sing of War. It takes us deep back into World War II, to the jungles of New Guinea. Horrifying, actually, to remember how incredibly violent war is, to 3 countries, as I said, and the whole book leading up to the moment when the bomb is dropped on Hiroshima. I talked to Catherine McKinnon and got her to start explaining the complicated story.
It starts with Lottie, who's a nurse who's just come over to New Guinea, very keen to learn and help and be part of the war. And she meets up with Virgil, a soldier, who they were both from the same small town. And the 2 of them are right in the thick of a battle that is just starting. It's the Itapi to Wewak campaign. It's the last campaign that was in New Guinea. And they've got these decisions to make every day, big decisions. They're working in a hot tropical climate, dealing with difficult stuff, but they've also got this kind of past from the small town, an event that happened that they've both got to deal with. And it jumps then to Los Alamos, which is in New Mexico, to the town that is like a military compound, really. It was surrounded by barbed wire. And there's 3 characters in this town, in this secret military base, which is there to build the bomb. And one is Miriam Carver, who's a young physicist. She's been plucked out of university to come and help. The other is Robert Oppenheimer and his wife, Kitty. And the story there revolves around the intricacies of making the bomb, but also the politics around it. At the time, there were scientists that were really concerned about what they were doing and making, and kept on wanting to check that what they were doing was right. There was a kind of a fervour amongst the younger people about, how to protect the future, a kind of international future, a global future. And then it also jumps to the island of Miyajima in Japan, which is opposite Hiroshima. And it follows there a smaller story about a woman, Hiroko, who is helping her husband's mother run a small inn that is frequented by the Japanese military. And also every week they carry rations up the mountain, Mount Misan, to 2 old monks who are tending the eternal flame, which has been burning for over 1,200 years. And it shows the life of Hiroko, and then something happens that disturbs or threatens her young daughter. She's got two daughters, and threatens one of them, and they have to take action. So it moves between these 3 locations.
And what's interesting, as we the reader are watching these 3 places, and these unwitting people heading towards this dreadful event, there's also connections between those 3 places through people. Can you explain what those connections are?
Yeah, look, Hiroko's husband is actually a soldier in New Guinea, and at one point he is taken prisoner by Virgil, who Lottie meets, so Virgil and Lottie from the same town. There are also 2 American twins. One is in New Guinea, one is a driver for Oppenheimer. There's various connections about what's happening with weaponry, what's happening with food. There's lots of links throughout, and it's about the connections that people have in these 3 different locations.
All waiting for this. We as the reader know what's going to happen. It's quite agonising, really. I found it really difficult about 2/3 of the way through the book, because you know that this dreadful event is going to happen. So what drew you to that story?
I mean, I never thought I would write a war novel, in fact, actually. It sort of came upon me. I was waiting for my book Storyland was being held by the publishers at the time, HarperCollins. And so I was starting on a new project. Storyland moves from the past to the future, and it's sort of got an interest in what's happening to the land in climate change. And there was a bit of word around that time about, there was going to be this Anthropocene, this new epoch announced, and scientists were thinking about when it might have started, and they were thinking of the Industrial Revolution, and another time they were thinking about was the first atomic tests. So I just started reading about, atomic energy and the atomic tests, and got interested in it, and thought I'd write a long short story. And then my dad was quite sick. He was in ICU, and he came out, and we would have weekly conversations on the phone. I live in New South Wales, and we'd talk. He was very elderly then, and never talked about the war. Just said he'd driven a leisure boat, is what he told us children. And we were talking. He was talking about how in hospital we kept hearing all these noises in the pipes, and it brought back these memories. And the conversation got a little bit difficult because we were talking about death, and he said, tell me what you're working on, to kind of get away from the conversation, I think. And I told him, and then he said, I have an interest in that subject. And he started to tell me the first real war story he ever told me, which was about being high up on the mountains, dug in, with not much ammunition, waiting for an ammunition drop, waiting for a food drop as well, with Japanese on the other side. They didn't have much ammunition either. And then just hearing over the wireless this information that a bomb had been dropped. and they didn't know much about it. It was the first time they'd heard the words atomic and just what had happened. And so I think just from researching about the American side of it, and then just hearing his stories, a long short story kind of grew into a novel.
It's amazingly detailed and quite gruesome, I have to say, account of war. How much of that came from your father, and how much further research did you need to do to get those horrible details about tropical disease and death and ways people died and things like that?
Well, I did obviously lots of stories from my father, but a lot of, there's day by day military diaries about everything, and there's 2 sets of them, and there's day by day hospital diaries, and so I just went to the War Memorial, went through all the diaries, which are, they also tell incredible stories of terrible destruction, but also incredible stories about ingenuity, what people do, the decisions they had to make, surprising things. They were really great. And so it's such while it's war is such a terrible, terrible, terrible time, it's also one of those times when people just do amazing things, amazing bouts of courage that make you sort of go, wow. And they were so young when they were doing that. So a lot of research on that. And then Dad told me a lot of stories that really seemed to pop up in the novel, things that disturbed him, things that he thought were unfair. But also I think he always said he loved New Guinea, loved it, and thought it was the most beautiful, beautiful place, even though he was there in a war. And he said it always disturbed him every day to be there fighting a war and thinking, what are we doing to this amazing country? And every day he said there would be something that you would see, a bird or, a chat in a village, or that would just remind you of the other side of life, how wonderful life was. So it was really that sort of mixture of how war can be tragic and terrible, but that it can illuminate the wonderful things as well.
Did he get to read the book?
No, he didn't.
Oh, how sad.
No, he unfortunately died before it was finished. So he didn't, well, even before I'd really, got the chapters structured and were writing. So I talked to him about it and, but no, he didn't.
Did you have any feedback from people, because it is a war within living memory for the very old, feedback from people who went through all that about how it brought it back to them?
Actually, more the sons of people who'd been in war. Quite a few people have written to me. Some nurses I've met along, as you go around and sort of tour the book and discuss it. I've met some nurses from New Guinea, actually, a little bit after that time. But they knew New Guinea and they'd worked there, and that was really fantastic. That was a little bit later. And then a couple of people have written to me about, their fathers in war, and it sort of brought back the stories they'd been told, and
it gives you a whole different appreciation.
Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast. Ozcast. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Of what that generation went through.
Yeah, I know. And I've got this great love of nurses actually from doing the book. Just the way that the strength that they've got, and just meeting quite a few, not really people from that time, but people who went there after. That's been great.
In the book, Lottie has to deal also with sexual assault, which we don't hear much about that. That's certainly papered over in the stories of nurses in war, but that must have been a danger as well.
It was, and also I really, you think now, why do a war novel? But I think what I really wanted to do was to bring the idea of women and children and what happens to them, and they're part of the actual war. And so kind of talk about that. And also really rape goes on not just in war, but it goes on all the time. So part of it is kind of going, well, if rape always happens in war and if it's still happening now in our lives all the time, women are being raped, why is that? And what's the link, in terms of violent energy and violence within us? And so it's kind of, even though it's set in World War II, it's kind of thinking a little bit about violence just as in general, now and then. And I think the The other thing it's sort of maybe trying to deal with is, the people who makes our decisions, and, do we trust them? Do we let them make our decisions? Is that right? Just because they have positions of power, does that mean they're making decisions wisely?
And that certainly comes out when we move to Los Alamos, with the inside story of who was worried about what in that lead up to the bomb being dropped and to the test. And the relationship between Robert Oppenheimer and his wife Kitty. It's a fascinating dive into all that. And I was just wondering, reading it, how much is fact and how much is fiction?
Well, there's a lot of fact in there, but there's also what you do, I suppose, is kind of weave the fiction into the areas that are either not known. So there's, they had a very volatile relationship. That's all known. There's a lot of bad press about Kitty, and I tried to, but there was a few scientists female scientists, who in transcripts said things like, I don't know why Kitty gets such bad press. She was an amazing woman. She was such fun. So there were a few people that gave opposite opinions. And so it was good to delve into her life and sort of think about why was she a bit despised at that time, and to try and make that a little bit more present for the reader, that maybe it was actually to do with her cultural background and things about her being German that were kind of setting suspicions against her. And, obviously her own personality. She felt trapped in that environment, locked out of all the discussions. And she was someone who loved to be in the thick of it, talking about stuff. So I looked at both the historical research and transcript, but also there's a lot of gossip about the Oppenheimers, gossipy books. And I just tried to look at their lives and weave something that felt maybe, in between, I suppose, the gossip and the history.
It was such a moral dilemma, wasn't it? Because people who really meant well, who just desperately wanted to end the war, bought the story that dropping the bomb would do that.
Yeah. I mean, it's still incredibly contentious, everywhere. The way that the history is told is still manipulated now, and certain aspects of it have shifted and changed over time. So there was, immediately after the war, it was just like, we've done a fantastic thing, this is brilliant. And then it shifted and changed over time. And I think the Japanese community were pretty amazing after the war in taking on responsibility for their part in it. Even when you go to the, Hiroshima or the Nagasaki museum, the people that you can talk to there, they're so for peace and they're so balanced about sharing out the blame, about the different nations, and the people who ran those nations were the people that were responsible, and the ordinary people were the people that had to suffer. But still, the ordinary people are the people who need to help promote peace.
What would have happened if that bomb had not been dropped? Is that something in all your reading you thought about?
Yeah, there's a lot of discussion about that, about whether it needed to be dropped, about whether, even that happened in the meetings leading up to it. People were saying, let's drop it on an island and bring Japanese dignitaries to the island to witness it. And there was doubt about whether it would work. Even, in the first test, they didn't know if it would work. So that were the reasons that people put up for not doing that. But at the time, the Japanese were negotiating for some kind of peace. The thing that was the sticking point is they wanted safety for their emperor, and that was a sticking point for the Americans and for the Japanese. The Japanese wanted safety. The Americans didn't want to guarantee that at the time. So, it's in that area of grey area of, was it really necessary to drop it? Could they have not dropped it? Could they have got over the war? That is a kind of grey area.
I suppose so, but at the same time, it had been invented, whether it had been tried or not, and it really, that has led not to peace, but to a terrifying build-up of Cold War, hasn't it?
It has, and the thing is, several of the scientists, Niels Bohr was a Danish physicist who was lobbying Roosevelt and Churchill to bring the Russians in, because he thought that what would happen. There would be a build-up of a Cold War afterwards, where everyone kept their secrets about, what the weapons they were building. And so, yeah, look, it's not handled well ever, because having those weapons means you're powerful, and countries powerful countries want them, and also small countries want them if they can get them.
One other thing that you've done is bury a good old literary reference in that Virgil, who's one of the characters in PNG or in New Guinea, and there's a subtext of the poem by Virgil the poet, the Aeneid. Can you explain how that connects to the story? It's about Troy and Rome, not about modern bombs, obviously.
No, but I think I wanted to bring a little bit of myths in because, our own war history is myth in a way, becoming myth. It comes from something real, but it moves into an area where people don't question certain things. And stories, I suppose, bring in that. I'm not saying that war is a myth, but that the origins of myth are often a true story. And that to make that link back to the past and to past war stories, the Aeneid is a story of the Trojans leave and try to find a new home. And you can read it as a story of colonization because they go to Italy, or a story of refugees, depending on, who you are. But it's a story of what happens after the wars. And I suppose just bringing that in, the idea that we create these stories and then they move into another, become a kind of a legendary force for later period. I just wanted to bring that in. And also because the Aeneid was kicking around our house when I was growing up, a plastic covered Aeneid it had all the names of my brothers and sisters in it. I came from a family of 8 and it was just always kicking around. And so, with each child would put their name when they went to study it. And so it was just, I suppose that too was part of it, just bringing in the fact that those stories are still part of our lives, but in different ways, and that they were once related to real events, likely.
Just one more question I've got for you, Catherine, and that is, as far as inspiration or, your favourite authors over the years, who would you name?
Lots. There was a great book by Pat Barker, 3 books, Regeneration Trilogy, about the First World War. That was definitely an inspiration. They're fabulous books. If you haven't read them, they're amazing, that trilogy particularly. I really like David Mitchell. But
I was just going to say, I've been saying to everybody that your first book, Storyland, reminds me of an Australian David Mitchell.
Yeah.
And I love it for that reason, the layering of history.
Yeah. I really like David Mitchell. He's fantastic. I like lots and lots of people. Kate Grenville's also a fabulous Australian writer, and Tim Winton. I like a lot of the braided narratives. The Overstory I really loved. And I think one of the stories I held by me in this time, I often went back to read this book, through it actually, and it's Cukooland by Anthony Doerr. So Cukooland also jumps in time, a little bit like the David Mitchell, and it jumps from the past to the future, and it's fabulous book. What I liked about that is a kind of muscular writing as well, very visual, poetic, but really readable, really focused on story, but also a braided narrative.
I like the idea of braided narrative. I haven't heard that term before, but it certainly describes that freedom to move between different stories and different places and times, and tie things together as you've done in this book. Catherine, thanks so much for talking to us today on Tsundoku.
Thank you.
Catherine McKinnon talking about her book To Sing of War, and as I said, I love that idea of the braided narrative.
You're listening to Tsundoku, the podcast for addicted readers and those who often find themselves saying, nice movie, but the book was so much better. And time now to hear from poet Ken Bolton on why he's become addicted to the writing of Beryl Bainbridge.
A year or so ago, I'd decided that none of the English male writers that I'd read in the past interested me much more, enough to revisit them. And I thought that the women writers of the mid-20th century were sort of better sentence by sentence than the blokes. And so I read it just partly just because I thought I liked the language of these writers. And I read a number of them. I remember thinking Elizabeth Bowen was fantastic, and I still think she is. She's really great, hugely intelligent and does interesting things. that should be impossible, actually, and they seem to break the rules. And then I found Beryl Bainbridge, and she too is really terrific. And she's different from the others in that the well-known novelists seem to be slightly upper-class Oxford, Cambridge types. They're usually very good in their first few books, and then they begin to write novels about rich people's affairs and dalliances and money and good manners and bad behaviour with good manners. And I guess readers find that stuff interesting if they're of a middle-class, educated sort. But Beryl's not one of those people. She's, I think, Manchester-born, anyway, Northern English, educated, but not from a rich background. In fact, possibly from a mildly poor background, but she paints it in her books as poorer still. Well, she's fantastic because she does such surprising things. From novel to novel, the sequence that I read them in was to begin with An Awfully Big Adventure, which is a young teenage girl joining a theatrical troupe and hoping to become an adult and part of the real world. It's very funny. It's also very sad, and often you don't realise how sad it is till afterwards, and very unusual. I liked it a lot. Then I read Injury Time, which starts out with these fabulous representations of two absolutely awful guys, middle class, unpleasant to their wives, middle-aged. They're sort of business types. They're awful for a long, long while, and you laugh at it. She's very funny about men. And then the second half of the novel is changed entirely. Everything's tossed on its head. There's a home invasion. The 4 or 5 people at this dinner party, the 2 men and their a wife and a girlfriend, are joined by these feckless criminals who hold the house up, and the police surround the building and surround the block. And so things are turned on their head, and the 2 women take charge of their own safety, and it has an interesting ending. She's great on men. She's very interested in men. She thinks she's interested in how awful they can be, but also she likes them a lot, and she's interested in how they can be good as well. And so right through her novels, men are sort of maybe the main interest, more than women characters, which maybe pleases me, I'm not sure, but anyway, I find it readable. The third one I read was Master Georgie, a very odd account of the Crimean War experience. I mean, it brings you to tears at the end. It's an example of a characteristic of her all the way through every novel that I've read so far, is that she can be incredibly sympathetic to people for a number of pages, or quite a few pages, or a scene, and then very funny about them and at their expense a moment later. That's always a breath of fresh air, and it moves things along very quickly. But her sympathy for people and fellow feeling for them is just fantastic. Somehow definitely there, and it's interesting because a lot of these books are based on real stories, maybe most of them to some extent. Like she would go to the library and just read the minor ads through the papers, the wants, the personal ads, and think, oh, that's an interesting situation I can see building up here. What if I wrote about it as though my family, my parents and my brother and me were the characters? How would it play out? Well, she had to do a lot of inventing in telling the stories, and I like the ones best where she has most need to do that because there aren't too many facts. So Master Georgie, I imagine, is one of them, and it's fabulously imagined. Some of them, the history ones, are great if you want to read about that history. There's one called The Birthday Boys about Shackleton in the pole, losing his men, making every mistake possible, and it's constructed around each of the guys who are part of the team. Each of them gets a chapter, and that's about it. The first chapter is fantastic, and that's the person she probably has least information about. He's the working class muscle guy that's going to be doing a lot of the heavy work. You know, she's got to tell you the story as it happened because we all know what the story is. Whereas the books where there is less for her to go on, she has more freedom, and I think they're fantastic because they're closer to the fiction. I suppose the fiction ones are the ones I prefer, although Master Georgie was really fantastic. There was one called Watson's Apology, which I left till last because it looked like it was going to be just awful. A man kills his wife, and that's the plot. It's miles more interesting than that. Totally gruesome and yet very funny sometimes at the most awful moments. And you catch yourself laughing at this and you think, and also you know that she is laughing herself as she writes it or when she finishes a section, when she thinks, wow, I know that will have blown you away. According to Queeney was one that, I knew I was going to be interested in because it's about Samuel Johnson and Queeney, the woman whose wealthy family he kind of moved in on and became a part of. He was infatuated with her and she was infatuated with him maybe. She was a sort of a fan and liked to have him around because he was so socially prominent and famous, and so she was collecting a scalp in that way. It's the story told from her daughter Queeney's point of view, who was only 12, 14, 10, lived there for a few years with Johnson hanging around in the house doing his usual stumbling and bumbling and turning on a dime in the corner and all the things that we love him for if we've read the usual accounts of him. She doesn't love him anywhere near as much, and she's not very happy about her mother, who she sees through. It's great because it's probably true. It's documented because Queeney left an account of it as an adult, and so it's a corrective to one's view of Johnson, or at least an addition. It's his last failing and very unhappy years.
What about her non-fiction?
Quiet Life, that's the one that's about her family. Well, it's fictionalised to some degree because she depicts them as quite impoverished and living in a very small house. And I've seen a documentary where she revisits the house, and it's quite a substantial middle-class suburban house. And she says she's never made up a story entirely. She takes a fair amount of liberty with, and I like them best, as I said, where she takes lots of liberties.
What about her reputation now? Has it come around again?
Well, I think she was quite highly thought of in the 80s and 90s and was called the Booker Bride because she was nominated for the Booker Prize so often and never given it until a special award was mostly made to give it one to Beryl before she died. I don't know if it was before, it might have been after even. That was for Master Georgie, and very well deserved. That was probably a high point. There would have been a high point later because most of the books that I'm reading are reprints, so they've come out in new editions. I imagine that she's not going to disappear as a name. The books are so good.
Ken Bolton talking about Beryl Bainbridge. You won't have any trouble finding her works in your local library or second-hand stores.
We'll probably bump into you in the library from the sound
You
of it, Kath.
will. Or in the second-hand stores.
You're listening to Tsundoku, the podcast for people who, when they're not reading, want to listen to authors talking about what they're writing and readers talking about what they're reading.
Hi, I'm Mike Ladd. I'm a poet, a writer, an ex-radio producer. I'm now in my 60s. The first book I remember probably being read to me was a book called Wylar the Cockatoo, which was given to me by my grandfather. It was a lovely book by Leslie Rees, sort of Australiana, but very atmospheric, and even just the name, Wylar, it's the sound of the cockatoo. So I found a very poetic book. It's just the life of a little black cockatoo. I had a childhood that was quite rich with books. Certainly the Narnia series, Tolkien, The Sword and the Stone, Once I got into high school, I loved things like Catch-22. I sort of skipped Victorian literature for a long time. I loved contemporary Australian American literature, so I liked people like Kurt Vonnegut when I was young, and I avoided things like Jane Austen and George Eliot. But now I love them. I've been patching up those holes in my education. I suppose a very key book for me that that probably did change my sense of who I was and what I wanted to be was Robert Frost's collected poems, which I read when I was 16 and began to memorise. And I actually, I think that was a factor in me wanting to be a poet. So I would say that was a key book for me. Tsundoku, yes. Well, I do have quite a pile of books beside my bed. When it comes to poetry, I've got Elizabeth Bishop's selected poems. Elizabeth Bishop was an American poet that I think's fantastic, and I've been sort of with poetry. You come back, you don't read the whole thing in one go. You just nibble at it. You can read a page here and a page there and think about it for a while. So you don't necessarily read it cover to cover. I do have some novels beside my bed as well. I've been very interested in Annie Ernaux, who won the Nobel Prize last year. She's a French kind of documentary writer. It's very rare that somebody who writes non-fiction wins the Nobel Prize. And it's a book called The Years, which is essentially her life. She sort of was born just before the Second World War in Normandy, and her village was destroyed. She was working class, the daughter of shopkeeper parents. And it's her life from, say, the 40s through to virtually today, but all the eras of French politics, the war, the Algerian War, the coming and going of different movements, feminism, all sorts of things are worked in, with also a lot of kind of like news flashes, like media from the times. It's documentary and very much about working class life. My Tsundoku sort of shrinks and then it grows again. So I've just recently added John Kurtzeya's new one, The Pole, and Lucy Treloar of Salt Creek, which is about the Coorong here in South Australia. Yeah, so they're on the pile as well.
And if you do want to tell us about your reading habits, you can contact us at tsundokukast@gmail.com. And that's it for Tsundoku. Hope you've got a great book waiting there next to your bedside. I'm Annie Hastwell.
And I'm Kath Keneally. We'll catch you next time.
This podcast is produced by 4 book addicts refusing treatment.
Kath Keneally,
Michaela Andreev, Sarah Martin,
And me, Annie Hastwell. Our thanks to composer Quincy Grant for the music. If you want to know more about the books and authors featured in this episode, check out the show notes. You can find us on Facebook and Instagram at TsundokuCast. That's TSUNDOKU cast.
Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free. And you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.